Morning, everyone. I am here with lesson 25. So make sure you have your problem set with you. And if you need a multiplication chart or calculator, grab that. You'll want to use that today too. Today we're going to be dividing whole numbers by fractions. So we're going to start by looking at on part 1. They gave us an example. We're going to go through that before we start a new one. So the problem that we're looking at is 2 wholes divided by 1/3. So the first diagram here shows 2 wholes. So I have a number line that shows 2 wholes, and my tape diagram is marked 2 wholes. You'll also see that for each whole, I split it into thirds. So these should be marked 1/3, 2/3. This is 3/3. That's 1 whole. 4/3, 5/3, and 6/3. Okay. So if I'm looking at the prompts here, there are blank thirds in 1 whole. So if I were to ignore this second whole and just look at from 0 to 1, how many thirds are there? So I can count the parts in the diagram. I can also look on my number line and see that in 1 whole I had 3/3. So there are 3 thirds in 1 whole. Okay, the next part says there are how many thirds in 2 wholes? So now I'm looking at my whole diagram. So if I count my thirds, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So in 2 wholes, there are 6 thirds. So basically, if I had 2 cakes and I cut each cake into thirds, I would end up with 6 parts. Now the second diagram is showing that if 2 is 1/3, so if 1/3 of the whole thing is worth 2, what is the whole worth? So I made a diagram and I split it into thirds because it's asking us if it's 1/3, there need to be 3 parts. So I have 3 thirds here, but I shaded in just one of them. And I also made my number line so that this 1/3 is worth 2. So my number line, that first third goes to 2. So then I had to continue my number line, making each third 2 more wholes. So if one of the thirds is 2, that means this is worth 2, this is worth 2, and this is worth 2. So that means that there's 6 in all. The whole thing is worth 6. So let's try one. Let's try the next one. We have 4 divided by 1/2. Okay. We're going to start by making a diagram. So make a tape diagram. And I want to take the whole number, which is 4. That means that my tape diagram is worth 4 wholes. Underneath the tape diagram, I want to make a number line. It starts where the tape diagram starts, that's 0. And notice I'm making my whole numbers above the number line. Where the tape diagram ends, that's 4. So if this is worth 4, I want to make 4 parts. Each one of those is a whole. And on the number line, I'll mark each whole. So again, I have a tape diagram that's worth 4 wholes. And underneath the tape diagram, I labeled each whole on a number line. Now, I'm dividing by 1/2. So I want to take each one of those wholes and cut them in half. So what I'm going to do is just take each whole and split it right down the middle. Now, where I have a new line, I'm going to make a new mark on my number line. Then we're going to label the bottom of the number line. So this is still 0. This is 1/2, and 1 whole is 2 halves. Then I'm going to continue on the number line marking halves. So if I were to go to this line, I would have 3 halves. So 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves. Keep going until I end up with 8 halves. So let's look at the sentences. There are how many halves in 1 whole? So let's just look at this 1 whole, the first full box. How many halves are there in there? Well, I see 2. We know when we cut something in half, it's 2 parts. So your first blank there should say 2. There are 2 halves in 1 whole. Then we have to figure out how many halves are there in all 4 wholes. So there are 2 ways I can figure this out. I can count my halves on my diagram, or I can look at my number line and see that the whole 4 pieces are equal to 8 halves. So there are 8 halves in 4 wholes. Okay, now the second part, what if 4 was 1/2 of something? So let's do another tape diagram here. We don't know what the whole thing is worth yet, but we do know that it's cut into half. So I'm going to cut it in half. And I know that one of the halves is worth 4. So on a number line, I would have 0. This is 4. Ooh, sorry for that messy line. And then this would be, well, I have to figure it out. So from 0 to 4, I have 1, 2, 3. If this is 4 and that's halfway, I'm going to double it. So 5, 6, 7, 5, 6, 7, 8. So basically what I did was I multiplied that 4 times 2 to get 8. So if 4 is half of something, the whole thing is worth 8. So these diagrams are showing you what happens when you divide a whole number by a fraction. But if you look at what we did here, we had 4 and we ended up with 8. So I see a relationship here because I have a 4, a 2, and an 8. But I didn't really multiply by 2 because I'm dividing by 1/2. So here's the trick to dividing with a fraction. What you actually are going to do is really quite simple. So when I have 4 divided by 1/2, I need to change that so that I'm multiplying, but I can't just change the sign. I have to, if I'm doing the opposite of dividing, I have to multiply by the opposite of 1/2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep the 4 the same. The first number stays the same. The sign changes to multiplication. The opposite of 1/2 is if I flip it around. So I'm going to take 1/2 and flip it upside down. So now I have 2 over 1. We know that if we have a 1 in the denominator, it's just the numerator as a whole number. So this is actually equal to 4 times 2. And we know that 4 times 2 is 8, which is what we got as our answer. How can we check to see if we're correct? Well, we can work backwards. So I'm going to do 8 times 1/2 to check. This is my check. 8 times 1/2. Okay. To multiply a fraction, we know we do 8 times 1 on the top. So this would be 8 halves. That's an improper fraction. So I think how many times does 2 go into 8? 2 goes into 8 4 times. 4 is what we started with. So my check works out, and I know that 8 is the correct answer. Okay. We're not going to keep drawing diagrams, so we're going to switch over to the next page. Go to number 2. Okay. So here we're dividing and then multiplying to check. So A, we have 5 divided by 1/2. Okay, so let's go through the steps again. I keep the first number the same. When you're dividing by fractions, you don't do anything to change this number. So I'm going to keep the 5. Now I'm going to take my sign and I'm going to switch it to the opposite operation. So the opposite of dividing is multiplying. Then I take the fraction, the second factor, and I flip it over. So 1/2 becomes 2/1. We know that when we have a 1 on the bottom, it just becomes whatever the numerator is. So this is actually equal to 5 times 2. Think about it this way. I had 5 things. If I cut them in half, I'm making twice as many, right? So 5 times 2. If I had 5 pizzas and cut each one in half, I would end up with 10 parts. So if we think 10 is our answer, let's check. We have to multiply to check. So we're going to go backwards. We're going to multiply going this way. Okay, so I'm going to do 10 times 1/2. That becomes 10 times 1 over 2. So when I have 10 over 2, that's an improper fraction. So I think how many times does 2 go into 10? Or I think 10 divided by 2. That's a basic fact. And I get 5, which is what I started with. So my check works out. So 10 is the correct answer. Let's do another one. Let's do C. 2C. So I have 4 divided by 1/5. Okay. So again, the first factor doesn't change. I don't do anything with that whole number right now. I'm going to take my sign, which is division, and I'm going to switch it to multiplication. Then I take the second factor, which is the fraction, and I have to flip it over. So this becomes 5/1, which is really just 5 wholes. So 4 times 5 equals 20. Okay, so I think my answer is 20, but I have to check. So to check, I'm going to go backwards, multiplying. So I'm going to do 20 times 1/5. 20 times 1/5, which is 20 times 1 on the top over 5. So I have 20 fifths. This is just normal multiplying of fractions like we've done in the past. When I have 20 over 5, I think how many times does 5 go into 20? or 20 divided by 5. So you can use a multiplication chart there to help you. And we get 4. So since 4 is what we started with as our first factor, our check works out. So we know that we were correct. So remember, when you're dividing, the first factor doesn't change. You don't do anything with that. You take your division sign, excuse me, and you change it to a multiplication sign. You take your fraction and you flip it over. After you've done that, you just continue on with fraction multiplication. So you're going to continue to practice. For my class on Google Classroom, it's not the exit ticket problems. I assigned you E, F, G, and H from the problem set. That's what you're submitting today, as well as problem number 3. It's a word problem. Okay, so if you have any trouble with anything, please email your teacher. Send us if you have your teacher's number, you can send a text, leave a question on Google Classroom, and have a great day. Bye.